I actually have a theory. I think I figured it out. Okay. I think I figured out what the actual concern is from
Okay.
Putin. Because we kind of talked about this before. Putin, like, it seems like Putin really kind of became upset with the West, not over NATO expansion, but over the war in Libya.
Hmm.
And part of the reason that he was so upset about the war in Libya is because A, he was friends with Gaddafi. B, Gaddafi basically played along with the West. He gave up going towards nuclear weapons and getting assurances from the West that he wouldn't be deposed. And the West kind of betrayed him, I guess, depending on how you view it, by setting up the no-fly zone once the revolution in his country started.
And also, Gaddafi did die in the streets a horrible death. Like,
Yes, and Gaddafi, who was Putin's friend, did die horribly by basically he ran away. He hid in a little spider hole. He was dragged out. He was anally penetrated by a bayonet, and he died horribly naked in the streets. And I believe there's a video of American diplomats, including Hillary Clinton, like laughing about it or something.
yeah.
And
And
this,
Putin's going, this doesn't look good for me. What
right?
else? You know that that there was a peaceful transfer of power between Putin and Yeltsin because Putin guaranteed Yeltsin's safety. Did you know about that?
Yes, that's part of why Yeltsin chose Putin to be
Right.
his
Yes.
next in line. Was he needed someone who would make sure he didn't die.
Yeah. The same death as Gaddafi.
Right,
That is usually the death of the dictator.
right. Yeah, and the fourth and the big reason why Putin was very upset by Libya is because he's afraid of getting Gaddafi'd himself.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so if we think about that and we say, okay, if Putin's concern here is that he's going to get, brutally killed like Gaddafi, that means his concern isn't that NATO is going to invade his country. His concern is that either there's a civil war that's going to ferment in his own country, or someone in his government or the military will betray him. Okay.
Yes.
So he's got either military betrayal or revolution. These are the two things that he's worried about, which makes sense because if Russia is not a democracy, if Putin views himself as president for life and an autocrat, and he basically runs the country like the mafia, that's what you're worried about. That's really the only threat to his political power is some sort of violent coup against him.
Yeah.
And so if we start to look at it from that perspective and say, okay, if Putin's real concern is a violent coup and it's not NATO invading his country, why does he care about Ukraine? Why does he care about Georgia? Why does he care about any of this stuff? And suddenly you go, oh, because Putin needs insurance policies. Okay.
Hmm.
Because think about it. If Russia is surrounded by NATO countries and there's a revolution within his country, he's going to be all alone.
Hmm.
There's a possibility that UN or NATO will try to set up a no-fly zone like they did in Libya.
Hmm.
And there's also the possibility that Putin needs an external insurance policy. He needs an external friend to turn to in the case of revolution or civil war in his country. So if the Russian military betrays Putin, some high level general tries to take over the country or something,
Hmm.
he needs to be able to turn to, Belarus or Georgia or Ukraine or all these countries
Right.
that have the militaries that would be friendly to him that would come into Russia and help him maintain power. But if he's surrounded by NATO countries and there's a revolution that breaks out in his country or a civil war breaks out in his country, all his neighbors that are NATO are going to just cross their arms and turn their backs on him and say, oh, good luck with that. And he's going to get dragged out through the streets naked and get fucking killed.
Yeah. He's looking at
And,
the transfer of power.
right. And so suddenly when you think about it from that perspective and say that's why he needs to surround himself with allies, it's not because he's afraid NATO is going to invade. It's because he's afraid his own people are going to depose him.
Right.
Then suddenly this kind of makes more sense to me about what's going on and the threat of NATO encroachment. And I haven't really heard anyone bring that up yet.
Yeah.
So You heard that here first.
Yes. That's some pretty powerful motivation. You know, being sodomized by a bayonet really focuses the mind on how to solve this dilemma, right? I mean, and
Right.
even if it's not, even if it's even if he needs a friendly ally, I mean, he's got to be looking at places where he can escape to as well.
That too. That
Yes.
too.
So a
He needs to
nice,
escape.
friendly Ukraine, you know, Russian run Ukrainian government
Hmm.
seems like a optimal escape route as well. He's running out of escape routes, isn't he? I mean, where is he going to
He
escape
only
to
has
China?
Belarus basically, and I mean, he doesn't really want to run away to
Mm.
China because the problem with China is that even though they're friendly with Russia, it's not
They're not
like,
going to protect him.
well, they might protect him, but China's more powerful than Russia.
Hmm.
You know, he wants to run away to a country that's like subservient to him. He doesn't want to run away to a country
Right.
he's subservient
Right.
to.
Right.
And so that's a big issue.
He doesn't
And
want
I
to downsize.
right, he doesn't want to downsize. And I mean, I think more evidence of this, of my theory here, is that, he could have just, if the goal was just to destabilize Ukraine further, they already took Crimea. They could have just taken the eastern provinces and then called it a day. But they seem very determined to remove Zelensky from power
Right.
and to install some other puppet,
Hmm.
which I really think that that's what's going on here, is that he's looking ahead. And this kind of goes into the monarchy debate a little bit too, because I think part of the issue with judging things from a democracy versus a monarchy is that the argument that, oh, the monarch is going to be looking at the long-term future of his country. But I think that's the wrong perspective. It's more like the monarch is going to be looking at the long-term rule of themselves. They're not
Yes.
really, they're concerned more with maintaining their power base indefinitely than the country's, the health of the country necessarily.
So we can infer that Putin doesn't have a reasonable successor that he trusts enough to protect him.
Well, that's another issue too. We don't know. We don't know who that would be. I mean, because it's definitely not Medvedev. I can never say his name right. It's definitely not Medvedev because he's kind of seen as like the doormat for Putin. You know.
Right. Yeah, I've heard. I can't remember what interview I heard, but the Russian interviewee was saying that he's basically like the kitchen help. Like he referred to him
Hmm.
as just a servant.
Yeah, that's the way he's basically viewed. Is that he's just the yes man to Putin.
Right.
So, and I don't know. I mean, maybe in Russia, in America, I haven't really heard anyone talking about who is, if anyone is being groomed for a successor.
See, this is a giant difference between democracies and autocracies because in a democracy, you know, the Democratic Party looks out and they say, you know, we have a lot of garbage potential candidates here. We need to develop some candidates that could potentially take over the party, right? In an autocracy, you're like, okay, as soon as I start developing, as soon as I start, you know, mentoring a successor, that guy's going to off me. He's going to off me before I'm
Right.
ready.
Well, and that's why, and this is a problem not just in Russia, but this was a problem in Ukraine too. This is why I was very against both the Democrats and Republicans who were talking about trying to imprison or go after, Donald Trump when he's out of office, saying we're going to get him arrested, or go after or go after Hillary Clinton when she loses the election.
Yeah.
We can't you can't create a country, a stable country that's based around whichever political party loses, whichever candidate loses, gets arrested
Hmm.
by the person that won.
Right.
Because that's like, and that's the way that, Ukraine did have this tradition, unfortunately, and Russia definitely has that threat, for Putin or for anyone else, because then that incentivizes when people are going for power. Like in America, if you run for office and you lose, you're like, okay, whatever, you go back to your
The
fucking
private
mansion.
sector. Yeah.
You go back to the private sector where you get your cushy paycheck, you write a book, whatever, and you're fine. But if you're afraid you're going to get killed or arrested if you lose the election, that's going to incentivize people to act completely irrationally, completely insane during the process, and they're going to start doing really, really heinous bad actions to make sure that they maintain power.
Right. There's a lot of comparisons going around between Russia and Ukraine as well as democracies go. And I couldn't find any credible sources that Russia was anything more than just a fake democracy. The Putin's party basically hand selects the candidates that he's going to run against. And if there's anyone that looks promising, like they might beat him, he disqualifies them on some trumped
Yeah.
up charges. So, I mean, how is that like democratic?
Oh
Not
no, I
not
mean, of
remotely.
course. There was, the guy, I forget his name. There was the guy who was like the lumber baron or something. He
Yes.
had all these lumber plants and he was going to run against Putin. He was kind of becoming popular, and they, created all these trumped up charges against him to prevent him from running. And they imprisoned him and he ran away. You know, of course, it's par for the course. I mean, no one that I've talked to or even heard, even people that are sort of taking the Russian side on this, are even pretending that Russia's like a democratically that Putin
Right.
is a democratically elected, uh, president.
Right. Yes. Well, I've seen some people make that accusation, and I was just like,
Really?
yeah.
Okay.
Well, you responded. We both saw Robert Barnes had done a tweet
Oh,
where
right, right, right. Yeah.
he basically laid out all the accusations against Zelensky, and then
Zelensky, yeah.
said Putin was innocent of these accusations, and I was like, what? What?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. It's
What?
unfortunate. Well, we've talked about this. Everyone has their lens at which they view things from.
Hmm.
And sometimes like when your lens is correct, you're going to come up with the correct assumption, but if your lens is wrong, you're going to come up with the wrong assumption. And I think Robert Barnes's lens, because he's so like ultra libertarian, is that he is very anti the US government.
Yes, I
And so
agree.
when the US government's doing something wrong, he's going to end up like, oh, Robert Barnes is totally right about it. But sometimes when the US government isn't wrong, then he's going to come to some weird conclusions that you're like, oh, I don't know about that one.
Well, the thing that bothered me in particular about that tweet, and I don't want to throw shade at Robert Barnes. I like Robert Barnes, and
Yeah, I like
we
him
would
too.
love to have a
But
dialogue with him about it. Is that he's a populist. He constantly calls himself a populist. Like he likes Trump because he thinks
right,
of Trump as a populist. How can you be a populist and be in favor of what's going on in Russia? They don't have any. There's no populist movement in Russia that would be stifled immediately.
right.
It can't even
Well,
exist.
and to be fair to Barnes, I haven't listened to any of him and Viva's streams on this. So we're just judging it based on that tweet.
One
So there
tweet,
could
yeah,
be,
exactly.
yeah, there could be a lot of um, nuance that we're missing from that tweet.
Right. Yeah.
So,
All right. Let's continue with the excitement.
so regarding so the whole like Hillary broke the law thing, it's it's just you can't unless the president or the presidential candidate is like murdering someone.
Right.
And I said this even for Trump. Trump had probably broken all sorts of laws before he was president because he's like a rich billionaire. It's almost inconceivable for me to think of, business people not, evading taxes and doing all this other shit. And you setting up this structure where if you lose the presidency, you get arrested is just such a dangerous precedent to set up. It's got to be super, super worth it. And saying, oh, Hillary Clinton should go to jail for her emails, which I think was awful, but not worthy of basically risking the destruction of our entire, peaceful transition of power. But
I don't think they should go after Trump either. And you have these
I agree.
prosecutors in New York City that want to throw him in prison for fucking parking tickets. Like it's completely ridiculous. They're doing the exact same thing. Yeah, you can't have that structure because, I mean, talk about the slippery slope, and conservatives are usually the ones pointing out the slippery slope. You're going to be an autocracy in no time at all. Yes, I don't like people getting away with shit. Obviously, we're all Americans, but at the same time, you have to come to some kind of balance here. You don't want people you don't want people breaking the law and hanging on to power because they're worried about being imprisoned for parking tickets once
it's got to
they're
be
out of
something.
office.
got to be something pretty severe that they broke the law at, I think, to merit going after them.
Yes. Just to maintain the stability that we're all enjoying.
Right.
We don't want to be the next Ukraine. I don't want them lobbing shells at our apartment building. Okay. It's so horrific. I don't know if you've seen any of the news coverage, but it
I
is
have.
just.
It's terrible.
Can
It's
you
really terrible.
imagine? Can you imagine? Like you're just going to work, living your life. You got your girlfriend, you got your boyfriend. You know, you're planning your wedding, whatever. Some fucking tank comes and blows up your apartment complex.
No,
What the
it's
fuck?
insane. It's totally insane.
It's terrible.